From the youngest age of our children in church, we teach them to shine their lights for Jesus. This little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine. But I wonder, what does it actually mean for us to shine our lights? We sing about it. Jesus preached about it, but what does it mean for us to actually shine? Do we even know? Well, I think the texts that we're going to look at in this session answer this question. And really, as we're wrestling with this whole thought, the gospel according to Isaiah, the good news according to what Isaiah has to say, I think it only makes sense for us to end this time together by reflecting on shining our lights. What does this look like in light of what God has done for us? So we're going to start off in Isaiah chapter 60. Here, I think God gives us a picture of what it looks like to actually shine our lights for him. Here's what it says in Isaiah chapter 60. Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord has risen upon you. For behold, darkness shall cover the earth, and thick darkness the peoples, but the Lord will arise upon you, and his glory will be seen upon you. In other words, even though thick darkness is everywhere, God's glory is coming and shining. This actually sounds a little bit like Isaiah chapter 8 and 9 that we talked about in another session. There, the darkness covers the land, and then God brings his light. Here, now, God's light is coming upon the people. You know how early in the morning the sun can crest over a hill and just illuminate the whole landscape? I picture that here as God says that his glory is rising upon his people. He's making them to shine with brilliance. In fact, he says in verses 19 and 20 at the end of the chapter, the sun shall be no more your light by day, nor for brightness shall the moon give you light, but the Lord will be your everlasting light, and your God will be your glory. Do you hear that? Verse 20, the Lord will be your everlasting light. God himself becomes the light that shines on the people. What was heavily implied, I think, in verses 1 and 2 are clearly laid out here in this section. God himself is the light. And so verse 22 reminds us, I am the Lord. In its time, I will hasten it. God is going to bring this about because his glory will be seen to the ends of the earth. Now, this is the idea. God's light is coming upon his people. His glory is shining on them, and they are sort of reflecting it to others. But what does it look like then to actually reflect or actually shine the glory of God in regular life, in regular living? What does this actually look like? And this is where I think another text can help us. Here, I think we need to go to Isaiah chapter 58. Several chapters back then, in Isaiah chapter 58, things don't sound as positive as they do in Isaiah chapter 60. God is in the midst of a discussion with his people about some of their sin and some of their wrongdoing. Here's what he says in verse 2. They seek me daily, and to delight to know my ways, as if they were a nation that did righteousness and did not forsake the judgment of their God. So the idea is here that they seek God as if they are a righteous nation. And maybe they seem good and right. Maybe they seem good and right to themselves. Maybe they seem good and right to others, but not so in God's opinion. So what is the problem? They say in verse 3, why have we fasted? They're talking to God here. And you see it not. Why have we humbled ourselves? And you take no knowledge of it. Good questions. Why are they doing all of these things and God isn't listening? And then finally, God gives an answer, verses 3 and 4. Because in the day of your fast, you seek your own pleasure and oppress all your workers. Behold, you fast only to quarrel and to fight and to hit with a wicked fist. Fasting like yours this day will not make your voice to be heard on high. Now, let's be honest. If any of us have ever fasted, surely we know what it's like to be hungry and then to get angry. I don't think anyone who's fasted reads this text and thinks, well, that's surprising that the people were fasting and then they got angry with one another. We feel terrible when we fast, and we can understand how you could take it out on other people. But this is more than God just being angry that they're hungry and then angry, right? They seem to be actually using their fast as a means to increase their oppression. So God says, no. You've missed the point then. I'm not listening to that. So what does he want instead? Well, verses 6 and 7 spell it out. Is this not the fast that I choose? To loose the bonds of wickedness, to undo the straps of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, to break every yoke? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry and bring the homeless poor into your house? When you see the naked, to cover him, and not to hide yourself from your own flesh. Maybe these ideas seem far removed from the idea of fasting, but it seems that there is an effort here to work to bring freedom to others. In other words, if you're going to starve yourself of something, make it power or influence or pride. The problem is that the people have missed the very heartbeat of God himself. And if the purpose of fasting is to more closely align yourself with him, then it seems possible that you could do the action with missing the purpose all along. The solution, then, is to actually tune your heart to hear his voice. Now, it's not that all of us should, in light of Isaiah 58, quit our jobs and go work at homeless shelters. It's just that God longs for his people to really care about the things that he actually cares about. And so, I want to jump ahead to verse 13 because I think this is key as well. Here's what it says there. If you turn back your foot from the Sabbath, from doing your pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight, and the holy day of the Lord honorable, if you honor it, not going your own ways, or seeking your own pleasure, or talking idly. Now notice what's happening here. They need to redeem the Sabbath. They've started treating it much like they've been treating fasting. It's become another ritual devoid of its intended purpose, connecting to the voice of the Lord. Now maybe this sounds a little bit strange to us. Sabbath? Really? Of all things, we've chosen the optional optional one of the 10 commandments. We've chosen that as the thing that we're going to talk about here, right? But notice the distinction that God makes. He doesn't ask them to cease the Sabbath. He asks them to call it a delight and to stop doing what they want to do, their own agenda on this day. Now, we don't have time to talk about this here, but let me just mention a few things about the Sabbath. First of all, I'm not so sure it's the optional one of the 10 commandments. I think actually it makes a lot of sense in its own context, and it makes sense for us to continue to practice the Sabbath today. Here's a few reasons why. First of all, Sabbath is the rhythm of creation. If you think about it, part of observing the Sabbath means that we hear the texts that talk about the Sabbath, like Genesis 2. You see, God roots the Sabbath in creation itself. And he tells the people in Exodus chapter 20, when they're supposed to observe it, he says, you observe this because this is the way that the world was created. This is the rhythm of creation. But also, Sabbath is a gift. It's not intended to be a burden. The ceasing from work is meant to be a blessing to the people. And for those who are workaholics among us, I think it is God's gracious way of getting us to back off of our relentless schedules. But also, Sabbath sanctifies us. Many have noticed this from their own experiences. It pushes back against my schedule, against my consumerism, against my pride, against my agenda. In Exodus 31, verse 13, even notes explicitly, it is by my Sabbath that I sanctify you. You see, Sabbath helps us to slow down and hear the voice of God. Observing regular Sabbaths can wake you up to the fact that you are not really listening to the voice of the Lord in your life. So, why all of this talk here about fasting and Sabbath in the middle of the book of Isaiah? And why are we talking about it here in this session on shining for the sake of the glory of God? Well, I think it's because of this. Sabbath and fasting are two areas where we can just check a box and mark that we've done it. Did I fast? Yep, I did. Did I Sabbath? Sure thing, I did. I'm good. But the reality is that the intention of these activities is not just to get us to check a box. The intention of these activities is to draw us closer to the heartbeat of God, to make his heartbeat ours. So when we stop pursuing our own agenda on these days and we slow enough to listen, God changes and transforms us. I mean, just listen what happens when fasting and Sabbath begin to do the things that God actually designed them to do. Verse 11, God will guide you in scorched places. You will be like a watered garden. Verse 12, You'll raise up the foundations of future generations. Verse 14, you'll delight in God and you'll experience incredible hope. But perhaps for us, the most important piece is what happens in verse 10. If you do these things, then your light shall rise in the darkness, and your gloom will be as the noonday. In other words, I fast, I Sabbath, and then my light shines. I refrain from eating and from doing, and in that God's light shines through me. I think Isaiah 58 says, yes, it does. Don't miss this crucial piece here. If Isaiah chapter 60 is saying that God's light shines on us, and then his light shines through us, it sort of reflects off of us as we're changed and transformed, I think Isaiah 58 reminds us that we are changed and transformed oftentimes by not doing anything at all. It's when we slow down, it's when we stop, it's when we cease, that we can tune our hearts to hear the voice of the Lord, and that God actually then can change and transform us. I think, though, we have one more stop on our path in order to understand what it looks like to shine. And this comes at the very end of the book, chapter 66. In this section, God is giving sort of his grand plan for the people, what they're going to do. Here's what he says in verse 19. I will set a sign among them, and from them I will send survivors to the nations, to Tarshish, Pul, Lud, who draw the bow, to Tubal and Javan, to the coastlands far away, that have not heard my fame or seen my glory, and they shall declare my glory among the nations. In fact, they're going to bring back people to God. But then look at verse 21. And some of them also I will take for priests and for Levites, says the Lord. In other words, God is sending people out. And the ones coming from the nations, these that come back to God, they are going to be priests and Levites. God seems to be including Gentiles here in his temple service. I think it's one of the strongest statements in all of the Old Testament about Gentile inclusion. Now, I want to pause here and just point out something about our current church culture. It seems to me that when we talk about shining our lights, we primarily think about our evangelism efforts, right? We think about the places we go or the ways in which we extend ourselves. But unless you are some super extrovert who loves to have uncomfortable conversations with strangers, we hear messages like that, and then we start to generally just feel bad about ourselves and bad about our faith. But I wonder if this is just a misunderstanding of the way that God has intended it. Sure, there is a willingness to go in these texts, a willingness to share. But once we've been placed into the midst of the darkness, God seems to take some of the responsibility off of us. He doesn't lay it entirely on our shoulders. Instead, he says, I have changed you and transformed you, and that transformation will be the very thing that draw people to see my glory. Now, sometimes we may feel the Spirit of God within us, pushing us out, but the glory of God is always attracting people to him. The glory of God is always shining and attracting people so that they might know him. And if this is the case, then I think this needs to change the way that we think about our mission. It's no longer then about me converting souls. It's not about me ratcheting up my uncomfortable conversations with people I meet about their eternal destiny. Instead, God has saved us. God has cleansed us. God has transformed us, and then he has asked us to shine that transformation to the rest of the world. And we shine just right in the place where God has set us. You know, this whole series has been on the good news, the gospel, according to Isaiah. We've looked at all of the various ways that Isaiah speaks to the good news that is ours. And I mean, we just started into the book of Isaiah here. There's so much more left to uncover. But perhaps it comes down to what we're actually going to do with all of this. Will we hear this word and live it out? Will we listen to all of the gospel that we've been walking throughout this entire book and then just leave it there? Or will we let the gospel change us? Will we let it transform us? And will we then let God use us to do the things that he wants to do in this world? Will we allow the gospel to transform us so that then we shine to the ends of the earth? I think this is the question before us, and the question as we walk away from this series, from the book of Isaiah, that we should ponder. Shine. That is the message of the gospel.